don't know me, and I am the Dean of the School of Journalism here at Stony Brook, and I want to welcome you to the final 2018 edition of a special lecture series that brings some of the top journalists in the nation and the world to Stony Brook. Tonight is a very special occasion for two reasons. The first is that every year, one of our lectures is devoted to the memory and the legacy of Marie Colvin, who was, for 30 years, one of the most courageous, enterprising, and talented foreign correspondents in the world. We have not one, but two very accomplished correspondents in their own right who are here tonight to talk about Marie's legacy, her life, and also about the war she risked her life to cover. In February of 2012, Marie Colvin, who grew up on Long Island, was killed covering the war in Syria, and she was 56 years old. One of our guests tonight is an old friend of the journalism school. Lindsay Hilsum is the international editor of Channel 4 News in Britain. And if you don't know much about Channel 4 News in Britain, it's not the same as Channel 4 News in New York. It is really the gold standard of news in the UK. Lindsay's been a foreign correspondent. She was the only English-speaking correspondent in Rwanda when the genocide broke out. She was in Baghdad when the US invaded in 2003. She's covered conflicts in the Ukraine, in Syria. And in 2017, we were lucky. Lindsay came and was a visiting scholar in the School of Journalism where she lectured, but she spent a lot of time researching and writing a new book about Marie Colvin called In Extremis, or Extremis, The Life and Death of War Correspondent Marie Colvin. It was just released. It's got terrific reviews. It's really a very special book, bringing Marie Colvin to life. Our second guest is Barnard, who for 6 years led the coverage of Syria for the New York Times. She was the Beirut bureau chief. She has been covering the Mideast on and off since 2003. She was in Baghdad for the Boston Globe. She's been in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, and across the region. She's been awarded with a Pew Fellowship in International Journalism. She's been awarded with a fellowship from the Columbia Journalism School Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma. This September, she returned to New York, where she's on leave from the New York Times, and she's a fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. But before we start the program, and I ask Ann to start by talking to us about Syria, and before I call Lindsay up to engage in a conversation about what she really learned writing this book about Marie Colvin, I want to say a few more words about Marie Colvin. In addition to Lindsay's book, many of you may know that there are now two movies about her life. One, A Private War, starring Rosamund Pike, has recently been released, and the other, Under the Wire, is a documentary about the last week of her life in which she was smuggled into Syria, and the photographer who accompanied her and who survived an incredible ordeal was able to bring out a lot of video and photographs to document what happened. We are going to show both of those movies, not tonight, don't worry. We're going to show both of those movies on campus after the first of the year. This attention to Marie Colvin 6 years after her death, to me, could not happen at a more opportune time, as journalism and journalists are under attack both overseas and the United States. Since Marie Colvin was killed in Syria, more than 400 journalists have died around the world. Many of them murdered just because they were journalists. trying to do their job. So calling attention to Marie's story, which is a story of great courage, her commitment to being an eyewitness, to truth-telling, to bringing us stories sometimes we don't want to see, but we need to see, I think comes at a time when we all need to recognize how important this is. So I'm going to show you now. Let's hear from Marie a little bit herself, in her own words for a few minutes. And so I'd like to acknowledge Marie Colvin's sister Kathleen and her two nieces, Michelle and Jennifer. If you would just stand for a second. It is partly through the generosity of the Colvin family that at the School of Journalism we established the Marie Colvin Center for International Reporting, which helps send our students every winter and summer on overseas reporting trips, in the hopes that we can give them some transformative experiences and just maybe, we will inspire the next Marie Colvin. On that note, I would like you to help me or join with me in welcoming to Stony Brook Ann Barnard. Thank you very much.
Hello. Well, it's always good to see a crowd like this for an event that's headlined something to do with Syria. That means you're still interested and maybe you still care. So our question tonight is, will the war in Syria ever end? And I am here to tell you that the Syrian war is not ending right now, just moving to another phase, as much as you may have hoped. And in the rest of the world, the ripple effects of this war are going to be felt for quite some time to come, in global politics, in warfare, in humanitarian issues, in debates over the very nature of truth and how we determine what the facts are, and in journalism. I don't know a single person covering Syria who hasn't asked themselves in the almost 7 years since Marie died, the 8 years that this war has been going on. It's hard to believe it's that long. If what we do matters, if we're even getting it right, does it make a difference? Is it worth the risks to us and to our sources? So how can we answer that question? We do know that, of course, Marie's final dispatch from Homs, the one that she died to deliver, did not end the slaughter there. Of course, bringing atrocities to light doesn't always stop them. Journalists are not that powerful as much as we might like to be. We have a colleague who, like me, started covering conflict in the post-9/11 period, who wrote a wonderful book, a wonderful review of Lindsay's great new book. And in that, she talked about this. She said that, maybe the complexity of Syria combined with the crisis in media and the challenges of covering Syria, as a result, the world remains totally confused about what really is going on in Syria. And she really ends up, although it's a wonderful review, I take a little bit of issue. She ends up concluding that essentially none of it mattered, that what Marie tried to do was the right thing to do, but it didn't matter, didn't make a difference. And maybe we all have to reckon with that as journalists. Well, I'm going to talk about what it's like covering Syria and the Middle East, and I'm going to make a case to you. Not only that Syria still matters, but the journalism does too, for Syria still today and for future Syrias. But first, we have to talk about Syria today. And let's be honest, Marie would be horrified to know that this is still going on. Just before she died, she said that this was some of the worst shelling that she had ever seen. At the time, what was happening in Homs, where she was, seemed like an almost unbelievable escalation of the war. It had started with protests, people asking just for rights and for political change, and security forces fired on protesters. There were mass arrests and torture. Some of the protesters started to take up arms and become rebels. By a year after that, Marie was in Homs watching as in the first major assault on essentially a neighborhood by the Syrian military. This was, at the time, this neighborhood was full of rebels who were back then mostly just neighborhood guys and the civilians around them. But even that was only the beginning. Now, 500,000 Syrians have been killed. Half the country displaced from their homes. 5 million people, refugees outside of Syria. Cities and communities completely destroyed. But let's also look at the toll a different way, the way that Marie would have. Just looking at the people that my team and I have gotten to know in the years of covering Syria. Let's take some examples. Rami Soleiman, he's a cheerful guy with a ponytail, one of the first contacts that my colleagues made among the civilian activists who were organizing protests at the very beginning. In 2013, he was arrested. He's never been heard from again since. I'm going to read you a list of names. Huda, Salam, Tariq, Sefo, Obaida, Tha'ir, Marwan, Hassan, Ala, Qusay, Ahmed, and Muhammad. Those are the people who spent months telling us what was going on in just one small part of the Damascus suburbs, and who, in the course of a few days, all had to flee their homes that they had stayed in under fire for years. The government was retaking the area, and rather than risk prison and torture, they accepted an internal exile to a part of Syria that they did not even know, held by rebel forces that they did not have an affiliation with. And those are just the ones that we happen to know among that group. Then there's the woman who worked in the Damascus Opera, who my friends met downtown, and a few days later she was killed by a shell fired indiscriminately at the city center by rebels from outside the city. There's Allah. She shared the story of watching her daughters raped and killed in front of her. She survived, she told the story, she fled to Turkey, and several years later she had to flee again, even outside the country. An agent of the government had come to threaten her. So now, the hot war does seem to be wrapping up. So you may be starting to hear in the media that things are going back to normal. And of course, when bombing stopped, that's pretty much always a good thing. But I just want to tell you one story. Right before I left Beirut, I had one of my last coffees with the source, a guy who had played an important part in the war. He was very depressed. He was complaining that he couldn't believe his family had sacrificed, had lost so many lives for the cause, just to end up with a destroyed country. The leaders he had followed were hypocrites. One of his sisters-in-law was considering prostitution because the family was in such dire straits. He was thinking about taking the risk of jumping on a raft and trying to get from Turkey to Greece and go to Europe. Well, this isn't that unusual, except for the fact that this guy, the interesting thing about him, that he's on the winning side, Assad's. So there are many geopolitical currents and wars within the war. So our colleague who wrote the book review was right about that. But when we step back, one of the main takeaways, the through line through the whole story, is actually not that complicated. People revolted against repression and inequality. They wanted a real say in their futures. President Bashar al-Assad used maximum violence, the full force of state power, to stay in power. Mass arrests, indiscriminate shelling, warplanes, chemical weapons, even starvation sieges. The goal to sideline the civilian opposition, radicalize the conflict, declare they were fighting terrorism, and crush all opponents, no matter the price. And it worked. It worked with impunity, so far. How'd we get here? The UN Security Council, when all this started, was deadlocked. Russia, along with Iran, backed Assad, while opposing countries like the United States got Teddy Roosevelt's advice backwards. They talked loudly, but they carried a very small stick. They backed competing rebel factions, enough to fan the flames and the bloodshed, but not enough to force concessions. Into the vacuum came ISIS. Now, in Syria's war, not so much in Iraq, but in Syria's war, ISIS was a byproduct, almost a sideshow. As brutal as it was, it killed much fewer people than the other dynamics in the war. But it did talk about Islamist ideology, it did stage spectacular attacks in the West, and so it became the West's major concern in Syria. American airstrikes drove it out of Raqqa in eastern Syria, and the more journalists uncover about that campaign, the more indiscriminate that looks too. So now what for Syria, which has been through all of this? Can we expect reforms or power sharing? Well, Assad has resisted any hint of those until now, so there's little likelihood that he'll start now. There are still 100,000 people missing within the torture dungeons of the Syrian government. Now that he's winning, Assad is not sidelining his torturers, he's promoting them. Russia doesn't seem to be able to force reforms and maybe doesn't want to. It wants to show it can beat the West. It does ask the West to pay for reconstruction of Syria so that refugees will go home. But they won't, not en masse, if they think they might end up in those prisons. Even security is dicey. Some insurgents are going underground. There's also extortion, kidnapping, even looting, and this is just on the government side, among different government groups. So we still have wars within the war to wrap up in northern Syria, where there are still some pockets held by rebels. In the east, held by Kurds. It's becoming a battleground between the US, Iran, Israel, and other players. So that's bad enough for Syria. What about the rest of the world? Well, a Syria that is ruled like by fear the way it was before, but with less resources and less stability, is not a recipe for fighting extremism. It's the opposite. Just when young people in the Arab world need dignity and they need hope and meaningful citizenship after the last round of Arab revolts was crushed. This war has normalized new levels of brutality for the 21st century: chemical weapons, routine attacks on medical staffers, and authoritarians are taking notes, not just in Saudi Arabia with the murder of a journalist, but around the world. I mean, Syrians used to tell me, and I used to, think that they were being histrionic. If our country burns like this, basic norms of democracy and human rights will be threatened in Europe and in America. I thought it was an exaggeration. Now I'm not completely sure. I mean, of course, Syria is not the sole or direct cause of every problem, but it did fuel and fuse some dangerous trends. Take this idea that as long as you're fighting Islamist terrorism, you can violate humanitarian and legal norms. That's a tack the US has been taking for some time itself in the war on terror. But Assad exploited it and supercharged it. In return, white nationalists like David Duke praised him online. For a lot of people, the news from Syria was just a blur of extreme violence. That just reinforced their general fear of Middle Easterners. So when Syrian refugees came flooding into Europe, that fear helped the far right drive Brexit and win seats in Europe. It may even have helped bring us Trump and his Muslim ban. Now, just recently, there was the Pittsburgh synagogue shooter. He was saying, just before the shooting, that he blamed Jews for bringing in terrorists because they were welcoming refugees. So, okay, I warned you that it was going to be dark, but that's why I think Syria still matters. So how can we as journalists act in this dark picture? Let's step back to how I got into this business as you guys think about going into journalism. Back in '86, when Marie was already covering Beirut, I was an idealistic high school student who had barely been outside of New York City. I happened to get a chance to travel to what was then the Soviet Union, and I immediately became inspired to learn Russian, become a journalist, and I thought maybe I will, go there, talk to people, create world peace. If Ronald Reagan is saying that it's the evil empire, maybe I can, take a more nuanced look. I did learn Russian. I didn't create world peace, but I did cover the early post-Soviet years for the Moscow Times. I was too scared to be a war reporter back then. I just wanted to understand people and their stories. But being a war reporter is just being a reporter who covers a war that's happening. So 9/11 shifted the focus for me. I was at the Boston Globe, and it felt like it was our responsibility to go and cover America's response. I covered Pakistan, Afghanistan. I fell in love with Syria especially, but all over the Middle East. But really, if a previous generation had, in terms of journalistic mission, Watergate and Vietnam, we had Iraq. You could not imagine a purer and clearer mission, a purer and clearer example of our journalistic mission. You know, we were not, the people my age in the field were not the ones who had been working in Washington covering the run-up to the war. So we weren't saddled with the baggage of having fallen for the false intelligence reports that were used as a reason for the war. So we just showed up in Baghdad and we could immediately see that something was wrong. Men were waiting around the hotel. They were army generals just waiting to be called for their chance to serve the country. And I really don't know who was more surprised, me or them, when the first order of the American Occupation Authority was to disband the army and fire them all. You know, we freely roamed around Baghdad, Fallujah, Ramadi. The officials in the American green zone, their safety zone in the middle of Baghdad, kept asking us, what was it like out there in the red zone? That's Iraq, where we lived. Even when it became too dangerous to go to lots of parts of the country because of insurgency and the threat of kidnapping, you could still hop on a helicopter and go with a US military unit where their struggles and their mistakes and their impossible missions would be right there on display. But I have to say, those questions started to nag about whether anyone was listening and whether it was worth the risk that we were taking every day when I was covering the Battle of Fallujah in 2004. It was clear even then that this would not be the last Battle of Fallujah, that this battle would not solve the problems in Iraq, that maybe it would worsen them, and at that very same week, George Bush was reelected by the Americans. Nonetheless, it took time, but actually, America did reach a consensus that the war was a disaster, and the world knows that in large part because of what journalists did. There's just a lag time. What do journalists do? They provided a set of facts, they start to write history. And Iraq, by the way, led straight to the mess in Syria. The occupation attracted al-Qaeda to Syria, sucking in Syrian fighters who later radicalized Syria's insurgency, and created missed opportunities. When the Arab revolts broke out in 2011, the bad faith with which America acted in the Iraq war made it politically difficult to lead credibly in the name of democracy and human rights. And for sure, it tainted Obama's calls that Assad must go. And when Syria descended into war, it made everyone, even including me, very skeptical about the idea of any US military action there. So now we come to Syria, where the reporting challenges were completely different, and so were the dangers. Our friend Anthony Shadid, the Times Beirut bureau chief, died a few days before Marie. He wasn't shelled like Marie was, but the conflict killed him all the same. He died of asthma while being smuggled out of Syria after a reporting trip. The government would not give him a visa to enter legally through the border. Covering Syria, journalists who do get visas, like me, I did it many times before and during the war, are heavily surveilled. Someone can say the wrong thing to us and get into a lot of trouble. They're trying to make sure that we report only what they want. Now, they don't always succeed because we don't leave our brains behind, just like when we go on an embed with US troops. We still have our reporting tools, our eyes and ears, but we do have to use other methods to cover the full picture. So journalists use technology, phone, online conversations, social media, geolocation. We meet people outside Syria and follow them inside. And we go to rebel-held territory, the most dangerous, especially later when ISIS and other kidnappers emerged. But in 2012, the main danger was the government's indiscriminate attacks and the effort to hunt down anyone who was challenging their story. And that's the combo that killed Marie. I was at home in New York then, with 2 kids and little kids, and my husband and most of our friends were in Beirut, gathered to mourn Anthony. And they woke up in the morning to the news about Marie. And it really seemed like too much. Like, this also? How much worse can it get? But forget about journalists, because that was the lament that I would then hear for years after that from Syrians. What is going to come next? A couple of weeks later, I flew to Beirut to fill in, and a few months later, I moved there as the new bureau chief and was house hunting. You know, if it wasn't weird enough to be moving my family across the ocean in order to take a job in which our friend had just died, my new normal at that time in the conflict was to study daily videos of helicopters shelling towns in Syria, maybe an hour's drive away. and talk on the phone or on Skype to people under fire. Later it was warplanes, then Scud missiles, then chemical weapons, then barrel bombs. And all the while trying to figure out how to get in there, not how to stay away from there. So Syria had a whole different set of reporting challenges than Iraq and other places I've covered. We couldn't have done it without this amazing team of Arabic-speaking reporters. First of all, there's Huwaid Assad. She's our Beirut reporting assistant and really fellow reporter. She grew up in the Lebanon Civil War, and she has built probably the world's greatest contact base of Syrians on every side, in every role in the conflict, starting from a few personal contacts and building them every night while chatting online, while doing her online shopping. A series of brave Syrian interns have each brought their own contacts and insights. They've been, one of them had already survived his own round of torture for delivering medical supplies to injured protesters, and yet he came with contacts on both the pro and anti-government side from his old life in Damascus, and he was still able to get in touch with them and listen to what they had to say. The trips could be surreal into government-held Syria. You're dealing with a police state where there's smoke and mirrors and a wrong move could get you arrested. You're also dealing with a war zone where you could be hit by a rebel shell, kidnapped, or run into all kinds of unexpected things. I'll just tell one of the many, many, many weird stories, and these were the kinds of things that we had to parse in trying to figure out what information was right. We were taken, and we didn't really have a choice, we were taken along to a secret police facility, one of the many facilities where arbitrary detention and torture goes on, and they said they were going to show us foreign jihadist prisoners, to show us that the whole revolution was just, something imported by foreign extremists. But the men they brought out were all Syrians, and they all said identical stories, boilerplate, as if they had been coached, and one of them had clearly recently been beaten on his feet. There was one guy, though, who was off message. He said that he was just a guy who sells walnuts by the side of the street, and he was arrested because he had been to some protests. And I was like, really? Why'd you go to the protest? And he said, Hurriya yani, which means like, like freedom. And I've really been worried about that guy ever since, because I don't know what they did to him afterwards. He didn't say his lines. You just try to keep this story from becoming a faceless litany of horrors. For instance, you remember the little boy who was found, who was photographed on the beach in Turkey after drowning in an attempt to get to Europe on a raft. His little red shirt, his little shoes tied up so neatly by somebody before he and his mother and brother drowned. That went viral. It became a symbol of the refugee crisis, but we really wanted to find the story behind the symbol. So I traveled to Iraq and Turkey and Germany to catch up with all the extended family, and each branch had their own story about weighing the dangers of escape and using their ingenuity to get their children out safely in all different ways, facing all different obstacles. But probably the most intense part of the work was spending countless hours talking to Syrians who have escaped almost unimaginable torture in government detention and neglect, terrible conditions. And the thing that's amazing about them and other people who've been through lots of other tough things is that they are so eager and driven to tell their stories and to help other people who have been through the same problems. Some of them are working for refugee organizations, for war crime prosecutors. And so there's a sense that they're willing to look at the next chapter in spite of what happened. We'd have to work a lot to balance our online and in-person sources, to cross-check them to see who was reliable. Some people that we talked to online we knew from before. Some we had been introduced to through a chain of people. So you don't know if you can trust these people. Eventually, we started to find out which people would lead us to stories that were maybe off message for the people that they were affiliated with. They'd say, this group is actually carrying out some abuses, or this operation failed, although they wanted to say it succeeded. Over time, over the years, we build up a sense of what's reliable and how we can get multiple sources for each thing that we report. That's not to say that there wasn't a lot of misinformation used by all sides. The war really weaponized social media, and I know this is something you guys work on here in terms of media literacy. One of the biggest efforts was by state-sponsored Russian trolls who were very, very effective in Syria. It was one of many dry runs for influencing the 2016 presidential election. But that's not to say there wasn't also positive use of online reporting. We were able to stay in touch with people we'd met in person and would never have been able to track. Like Abu al-Majd, a policeman who had been one of our minders. He told us he was getting shipped off as cannon fodder to fight ISIS in an area from which the senior generals were already retreating. We were later able to confirm that he was killed by ISIS after hiding out for a few days. And you know, time and again, we would just be watching and listening as people that we'd come to know over the years came under siege and shelling. I would take a break from my home office, go to the next room to tuck in my kids. They'd have the same usual nighttime fears that any kids have. I would tell them they're safe. I'm going to keep you safe. You'll be fine. And then I'd go back to my desk in the next room and continue my chat or my phone conversation with another mother who is saying the same thing to her kid, but she's not sure that she's telling the truth. You know, there were times that we had to watch videos of dead or dying children many times, not to be voyeurs, but to assess the evidence. And this is so far from what Marie did. Sometimes when I talk about this, I'm like, is this war reporting? And of course, it's not the same thing. I've done both. There's a difference there's a radical difference in terms of degree of danger, obviously. But the thing is, most of us mix the two. Most of us mix the two, and I've seen all the things you can see in war. The worst is I've seen a child die right in front of me. But those things don't happen all that often in a career. So now on top of this, we and other people that work with these types of video materials, on top of the in-person experience, we're adding a very high throughput of daily exposure to these kinds of traumatic events. So it's indirect, but it's a high volume. And there's this weird extra guilt involved because, you know, you're not next to the person putting your arm on their arm or sharing the danger that they're in. So I know this is something that Marie would have really struggled with. You start to just lose the contacts on your Skype because when you turn on the computer, the little green light doesn't come on. And so they're dead or they've disappeared or they've had to run away. And so there's many stories that were never finished because we weren't able to get back in touch to verify something. And that's real life, you know, that's the way stories don't tie up neatly with bows. So look, none of these types of reporting have the intensity and the immediacy of purpose of witnessing a shelling from inside a besieged rebel neighborhood in Homs. That was something very clear where Marie could say, I went there, I saw this, I did that, that was real. And in that sense, the government succeeded, or that level of violence succeeded when used by, you know, a player in the war. After Marie, it was clear that trying to be in that place again could be suicidal. But when you add up all these things we did do something. Through the stories that we layered one on top of each other with all the different methods that I mentioned, we did give a sense of the diversity and the magnitude of the Syrian drama. Without that meticulous daily sort of grinding work, I could not have given you the concise summary and the broad analysis of Syria's situation that I started with tonight. I hope we made it a little harder to see Syrians as an undifferentiated mass of the other. We brought to life the people who fought, what motivated them. We studied the impact of actions by the US, by Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and others. We documented that there really was a civil society movement, that there were countless Syrians who did push very hard for a middle way between government repression and Islamist repression. We showed how many people of that group were jailed, tortured, died, fled. We tracked their journeys into exile, where people are pursuing educations and new humanitarian projects, or to northern Syria, where they're still pushing for pluralism under al-Qaeda surveillance and government bombs at once. And some of them are laying low in the government areas, just staying quiet and hoping eventually to find a way to participate in rebuilding. One of my Syrian colleagues, Karim, he's a refugee. He's been away from his family for 7 years and he's only in his mid-20s. He's escaped death narrowly several times, covering battles in rebel-held northern Syria with my colleagues. He got the father of the drowned boy on the phone first and cried with him. He helped us carry out meticulous investigations. I told him that I was going to be talking about this with you tonight, about whether what we've been doing has mattered. And he said very simply, at least it matters to those people who wanted their stories told. This is why they sit and talk to us. And that's true. Marie would like that answer, and I'll take it. But I'll also add that bearing witness is real, but it has a way of sounding abstract or faith-based or something. We're also writing history. These stories are the beginning of a record. And like the history of Iraq, they may eventually inform policies or decisions or affect events down the road, the things that right now we can't see coming. And with that, I'd really like to thank you and invite Lindsay up to talk more about Marie, journalism, and her book.
Thank you, Anne. That was fascinating, and I have no doubt about the work that the New York Times has done in Syria, which I have read with admiration, your work and Hueda's and Karim's and everybody's.
Thank you. It's been a really amazing period of time. It's really great to have you here, and I've been reading your book with so much enthusiasm. It's obviously a sad story, but for me, it's just the most delicious read. And I was saying to Lindsay on the train that I felt as though I had somehow come into the possession of the diary of my cooler older cousin. Both to find out about the details of how Marie pursued her career and got to where she was, and also the details of her life as someone who's seen her from afar and really, looked up to her, but didn't know her like you did. It's thrilling to read this book. So what I wanted to know is what would you say journalists can take away from this book, and what can non-journalists learn? Because it was obviously written for both audiences.
Absolutely. Well, I think that for journalists, I suppose, look, she is in some ways a role model. Actually, I would say good and bad. I mean, a role model in terms of her commitment to telling the story and her determination. She would never be deterred. Marie always went in further and stayed longer. She was braver and bolder than the rest of us. But also Marie knew no boundaries. And I mean, obviously, as T.S. Eliot said, how can you know how far you can go until you've gone too far? Well, that was written for Marie. Marie always went too far, and that is in the end, she lost the sight in her left eye, crossing a front line during the war in Sri Lanka in 2001, and then, as we all know, she lost her life in Syria as well. And so, there are examples for journalists in all of that. And for non-journalists, I suppose what I learned from her diaries, she kept diaries from the age of 13 right up until just before her death, and
Excuse me.
She was such a complicated woman, and she had such a complicated life. And I think that what non-journalists can get from this book, I hope, is just this story of this extraordinary woman who was born here. She was, born in Queens and raised in Long Island, and had one of the most extraordinary, adventurous, perilous, remarkable lives, and was the most remarkable, charismatic woman. She happened to be in journalism, but she'd have been amazing whatever she did.
And, that makes me think about how much we talk in all this attention that's being given to Marie lately about the difficult stuff that she covered, the difficult issues she raised, the difficulties she had in life. But, what I remember about Marie is that she was sparklingly charismatic, funny, and fun.
Oh, absolutely. And I sort of rather fondly like to think of her and myself as the Thelma and Louise of the press corps. But the first time we met, I knew about her because she was famous, but we met in 1998 And war had broken out in the Horn of Africa between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And so we were in Djibouti, which happens to be the hottest place on earth. And it was this, the crazy situation. All sensible people are leaving the war zone. And what H.L. Mencken called a little bunch of madmen and women are trying to go in. Those are the journalists, of course. And Marie and I just happened to walk together across to this plane, Darlo Airlines. I don't recommend it. A Somali airline. And piloted by Ukrainians. And we got on the plane and sat next to each other. And as we kind of went down this lumpy runway, these two objects whizzed past the window. They were our pilots' sweaty T-shirts that they had hung on the wings. And we looked in through the cockpit door, which was open, two enormous Ukrainian pilots. Yes, they were flying bare-chested. And then Marie and I started laughing. And then the plane took off. And all the TV gear, which they had put unsecured at the front, slid down the aisle past us. And she and I looked at each other, and we were like two little children. We were like little girls in class. We could not stop laughing. And that was what it was like with Marie. Crazy things would happen, and you would just get the giggles. I'll tell you one other story, which is deeply politically incorrect. So we were on a stage once, a bit like this, in front of some very earnest people from Amnesty International in London. And a young woman gets up and she asks the classic question that people ask of war correspondents, which is, how do you cope with the trauma? So Marie looks at me and then she looks at the audience and she says, Lindsay and I, we go to bars and we drink. Oh, thank you, Marie, for my reputation. Had the merit of truth. But yeah, look, she was fun, and when you arrived somewhere and Marie was there, you thought, yes, I must be in the right place. Partly because she had such a nose for the story, you knew you had got to the right place, and also because you knew, yeah, now we're going to have fun in amongst all this pain and misery and difficulty.
I remember that very well, just her holding court on the balcony of the Dira Hotel in Gaza, where it looks over the beach, and just she would sit there and everyone would want to sit with her, and it would be like we were in, I don't know, Saint-Tropez or something like that. Well, look, I think this is a good segue to another thing I wanted to talk to you about generationally. So, by coincidence, or I'm not really sure why, a huge percentage of the women leading the news bureaus covering Syria and the Middle East lately for the past 5 or 6 years have been women.
Yep.
Almost all the major news organizations. So that's quite different from when you and Marie were coming up originally. So can you just compare and contrast a little bit and maybe some ideas as to why?
Yeah, it's very interesting that, foreign corresponding in general and war corresponding in particular was very much a male preserve. And it really isn't anymore. And I think that is largely because it's become a poorly paid, caring profession and therefore attracts women. Marie, one of the things which I loved in my research was finding out what a lousy feminist Marie was in her early days. She loved men. She loved looking beautiful. She was beautiful. And she didn't have, in the 70s, it was the sort of bra burning and, the idea that feminists were sort of dungareed and all of this kind of stuff. She bought all that for quite a long time. And then suddenly she was like, oh, actually, maybe what's wrong with these men? They seem to not want me to do this stuff. And then, so suddenly, as I'm reading her sort of enlightened, as it were, I was thinking, yeah, Marie, you could have thought about that a bit earlier, maybe. But, she had an evolution in that sense. She never let being a woman stand in her way. It was an advantage. Quite often, there's an early story of when she was in Iraq in the late 80s, during the Gulf War, the war between Iran and Iraq. And she and a Palestinian friend, Lamis, they managed to get to Basra, where a major battle was going on, because they just wore their hijab and hopped on a train, and they just looked like Iraqi women. And so they got the story which the men couldn't get. I mean, she said, very interestingly, in an article she wrote about it, that, that had been completely fine with the male journalists. They hadn't said anything. That is actually not true. Lamis told me that the male journalists were furious, as if they'd never used the old boys network or whatever to get their stories. But Marie felt very strongly, and I do too, we are not women journalists. Nobody ever talks about a man journalist, do they? Nobody ever talks about a male war reporter, but they will talk about a female war reporter. Well, maybe now that so many women are doing this, maybe that will stop. Maybe people will come to the conclusion that we did many years ago, which is that we're normal. They're a bit odd, the men.
I think it is a big change.
Yeah.
So, and I think it would be interesting to talk about something we were discussing privately earlier, which is a lot of the response we've had from even younger journalists, even younger than us, practically in diapers, wanting to ask, we have people like Marie as examples, who, and there's always a story about someone who goes farther and pushes farther, and maybe they have attendant struggles in their personal life and they take risks and they die, or they have some other kinds of difficulties in their life, and they said, where are the more sustainable heroes? And I guess what I want to say is not to cast ourselves as heroes, but let's say as role models. Here we are trying to make it through middle age and still do this job and not completely quit and not completely, lose track of the rest of our lives. What's been your journey about that, and who else do you see as being able to do that, and how?
Yeah. Look, I think that it is one of the tragedies of Marie's life that she struggled with a lot of this stuff, because she was utterly committed to what we do. She was utterly committed to the story, and she believed very strongly that it made a difference. If you'll let me, I just want to read something, because I think it is relevant to your question. That when she first went into Beirut in 1987, and she and the photographer she was with bribed a militiaman to stop firing a commander to get his men to stop firing for 1 minute. 1 minute. They could run across the no man's land into a camp which was besieged. And while she was there, a woman was shot by one of the snipers. And then she wrote, though her hair was clotted with blood, Haji Ahmed Ali seemed younger now that she had been cleaned. Her body was soft and shapely. She wore 2 tiny gold earrings. Someone opened her fist and cleaned out the handful of blood-soaked dirt that she had clenched in her pain. Now, one of the reasons I read that is because I think it's an incredible passage, and it really brings home the story of that woman. And so if we're talking about, sustainable role models, that was what Marie wrote. People who can write like that. I think writing like that as evocatively as that is just incredibly important. And I think Marie really, led the way in that. But I think that one of the difficult things is to do with the era that we're in. Because after Marie did that story, which was on the front page of the Sunday Times, which was a very influential newspaper at the time, and the militia, Amal, was sponsored by Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad. He, in turn, was sponsored by Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, who was influenceable, and the West put pressure, and within 3 days that siege was lifted. So Marie and Tom, the photographer, could point to this as having made a difference. And that, I think, was a critical thing in her life. And I think that is one of the things that's very difficult now. So I'll just read very briefly. The 24 hours she spent in Borja-Barajne had a huge effect on Marie. The image of the young woman lying on the path, her lifeblood seeping into the dirt, never left her. Haji Ahmed Ali had reminded her of Kat. The earring she had noticed was similar to a pair that she had given her younger sister. Years later, she would talk about that day in the camp and about the horror and fear she saw among the Palestinians there. She was proud of her story, believing it had made a difference. As a Sunday newspaper journalist, she had the time to get right into the middle of whatever situation she was reporting on, a variation on the famous war photographer Robert Capper's maxim, if your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough. Other journalists might remain at the margins, filing from relative safety, but not Marie. She would get up close. She would not write about herself. but her journalism would be distinguished by the intensity of her personal experience. Now, I still believe very much in that kind of journalism, but I'm also aware that the work which you were just talking about with Hueda and with others who are, minutely examining video that comes out and keeping in touch with people on WhatsApp and so on, this is now equally important to this kind of up-close personal reporting that Marie did. I think it was very important what you said, that the two are not mutually exclusive. So I don't know if I've answered your question about sustainable heroes, but I do think that Marie's way of doing journalism is the purest and the best, but there are other ways too, and we must use all the new tools to make sure that we take advantage of them, because there are other ways of doing it as well.
No, and you can't really do, you can't do the online part without also supplementing it with the in-person part.
Yeah.
Well, I think this was a great conversation, and I think what we really want to do is hear from our audience now. I think your questions will be really interesting. If you could come up to the microphones at the front and just, you can line up and tell your question.
Just come up to either of the mics if you want to ask a question. And just tell us who you are, okay?
Hi, my name's Emily. I go to Hofstra University in Nassau County, and I'm a journalism major, so I plan on going to this profession. My one question is, we've been covering in our evening news program about Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist from the Washington Post who died and was killed, and I was just wondering, what, from both of your perspectives, I guess you both can touch on this, about how do you deal with if your life is being at risk in any situations, and what sort of situations have you been involved with that could help with this sort of journalism that you're doing?
Yeah, risk.
Just to interrupt, did everybody hear the question? No. Can you just, either of you, just summarize?
It was about risks. The risk. It was about, you mentioned Jamal Khashoggi, yes?
Yes.
The
So
Saudi
like
journalist who
the
was killed.
risks that you take, and if you've had any risks of your life at any point, and how
Experiences of
you
risk.
can cope with that in this field.
Yeah. Look, we all take risks. Marie, as Marie said in the video at the beginning, you'd be silly to think that you could cover wars without taking risk, unless you want to do it from, the press room at NATO headquarters, where the risk is dying of boredom, or of dying of fury because you're being lied to the whole time. So yes, of course, we've taken risks, but quite often actually I sometimes think about a single bullet. I was once, many years ago, there was a very minor war between Uganda and Kenya, which lasted for one day, and it was something to do with a goat straying across the border. It was something completely insane. And I was very early on in my career as a journalist, and a bullet whistled past. It was probably, actually it wasn't chung, it was like, it was probably one of about 5 bullets fired in the whole altercation. And if it had been 6 inches the other way, I wouldn't be here today. So you don't always know. You can get killed in a really stupid war. But you calculate the risk. You calculate the risk. But I think that one of the other things that's really important is when you look at Syria. Marie was killed. Anthony died. Jim Foley and Stephen Sotlov, who were both kidnapped by the Islamic State and then murdered. But fewer than 10 foreign journalists have been killed in the war in Syria, and more than 100 Syrians. And that, I think, is the thing that we should always remember, that the people who are always putting their lives at most risk are the journalists from the country concerned. And that's not just in war corresponding. Increasingly, it's in investigative reporting, people who are investigating the nexus between corrupt politicians and organized crime. And that's come to the European Union. We've had 3 journalists killed in EU countries this year who were investigating corruption. And so that, I think, is a really key thing to look at. Do you want to say anything
No,
about
I don't
risk?
have much to add, except to say that one of the things that I came to understand early on was that it's okay to be scared when you're doing these stories. That there a wonderful mentor who, it's going to sound so dark. She also died in Iraq, but ignore that part. But she said that if you feel fear as you go into an assignment, it doesn't mean you're the wrong person for the job.
Yeah.
It does not mean that, and that's especially important, I think. Not to do the women thing, but it's especially important for women to say it doesn't mean I'm not born to do this. Maybe that fear is good and can be a tool for you to know what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Craig Klein. I'm a journalism major here at Stony Brook. Earlier you mentioned that despite the extensive coverage of all the diverse issues regarding the Syrian war, that most recently that there have been far-right leaders in Europe and the United States that have been attacking journalists. Are there any methods that you suggest that can be used to counteract these advancements by the far right and hold them accountable for the persecution of crucial journalists?
Well, I think, I think one of the issues that's plaguing the EU now is a question of what values and standards the community is going to have on issues like this. And I actually don't know, Lindsay, is it an EU requirement to have certain
Yeah, it's a freedom of the press. It's definitely an EU requirement, and you look at Hungary at the moment, and
could there be consequences for countries where these things?
Yeah, there could be, but they're also, they're also wet, that they don't enforce these things. But yes, yeah. But I mean, here in America as well. I mean, you have a president who tells you all that we're the enemies of the people. So what would we do about that? What do you do about that?
I think that it has actually woken journalists up to something that we were already starting to realize, which is that much of the public doesn't actually know how we do our jobs. Like, for instance, they don't know, not through any fault of their own, we have certain jargons and symbols within, newspaper readership. It's like a code. So, for instance, the word at the top that says Beirut, Lebanon, that's called the dateline. That means that the reporter was in Beirut when they wrote the story, or Damascus, they were in Damascus. It turns out that readers don't know that. So not only because of Trump and the accusations of fake news, but it has become more standard practice to show our work a little bit more and explain how we know what we know, so that that can bolster our credibility and also help educate readers about where we're getting our information.
Thank you for your response.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rachel Eiler. I'm a senior journalism major here at Stony Brook. And my question is, our classes teach us all about how to report and go get a story, but they will never teach us how to actually report on a war, let alone in a war zone. And one of my career goals is actually to be a war correspondent. And I was just wondering what advice you would have, and anything that you could tell us about, preparing yourselves to really go and get your story and be the voice for the people.
I don't think any of us consider ourselves to be war correspondents. I'm not a war correspondent. I'm a foreign correspondent. I do international reporting, and I have ended up doing quite a bit of conflict because that's what's happened in my time as a journalist. But although we call Maria a war correspondent because that's what she became famous for, she never called herself a war correspondent. She always thought of herself as a foreign correspondent. And all of us have done a lot of other things as well. It's just that people are more interested in the war stuff because they think it's glamorous. And my advice would be to not go to a war zone initially. And my advice would be to become a good journalist anywhere. And I think that, a journalist is a journalist. It doesn't matter where you are. There's plenty of good stories on Long Island. There's plenty in New York. There's certainly loads all over this country. Yes, there's fascinating stuff out there where history is happening. But I think that you learn to become a journalist and do the job. And then, if you're still interested in conflict or you're interested in a particular region, do that. But don't jump into it. What do you think?
I was going to say the exact same thing. When I was in Russia, I specifically did not go to Chechnya. I knew a freelance journalist who had gone down there and been killed in an airstrike, and I thought, wow, she didn't even know how to be a journalist yet. So let me be a good journalist before I escalate the risks I take. But nonetheless, we don't know when violence and conflict is going to become a potential part of our reporting. It can happen right here. If there's a riot, if there's, a natural disaster, if there's, God forbid, some kind of, melee that you get caught up in. The issue is to know things like first aid, to know things like how to respond in a crowd. And there are classes that are open to freelancers to learn those things, and I think that's probably useful for any journalist. Once you're a journalist and you happen to be covering a war because that's what you're covering, then how to cover a war safely is another skill that you'll learn, just the same way that you'll learn to use a tape recorder, or you'll learn, well, I dated myself, you'll learn to use a digital recorder, or you'll learn to use other tools of the trade and to know how to operate in different situations. But I encourage you to be a good reporter. Yes.
Hello, Vince. Okay. Hello, Lindsay and Anne. And I'm Huilin. I graduated from Stony Brook University last year and currently alumni. And I come back really glad to enjoy the event tonight and your speak.
Thank
and
you.
I do have a question because people usually discuss about the conflicting roles of women reporters in the context of wars and crisis. And what do you think empowers the women reporters stand strong when they see those unique barriers in the war reporting? Thank
Exactly
you.
the same as what empowers the men. There is no difference.
I'll say that too.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sasha Podzorov. I am a freshman journalism student here at Stony Brook. I just want to say thank you again for coming out here and talking to us. Bringing this back to Marie, I just wanted to know what your opinion was on the recent film of Private War and how accurate it depicts her life, or if it takes any liberties with her experiences or anything like that.
Yeah, look, it's a fiction. It's Hollywood. It takes a lot of liberties, and it changes the names of people who might get offended. I think it has... Rosamund Pike, who plays Marie, is amazing. And those of us who knew Marie, it's kind of spooky when you first see it because she's so good. You know, she has her movements and her voice. She's absolutely brilliant. And there's some very realistic things in it. And one of the things, Matt Heineman, who directed it, was very conscientious. He's formerly a documentary director. And so the Libyans you see there are not random Arabs. They are Libyans. And in the last scene, the Syrians who are with Marie, you know, Marie is with them in Bab el-Amar where she was killed, they really were Syrians from Bab el-Amar, and those are real stories. And I've talked to Rosamund Pike about this quite a lot. She found it, you know, really sort of complicated and difficult to deal with this. These were the real people telling their real stories. So I think that the film has a lot of strengths in that way. But, you know, we don't spend our entire lives being shot at or getting drunk. There are some in-between bits which aren't quite there in the movie, I would say.
My complaint about the movie is that it didn't spend enough time showing the thing that we spend the vast majority of our time doing, which is sitting there listening to other people talk.
Yes.
And maybe trying to encourage them to say more. You know, but that, you know, sometimes for hours, well, they first say like 30 minutes worth of stuff that isn't the thing you wanted to ask about, but they really want to tell you about it. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, and that's a sort of inherent problem in the movie, because obviously the movie's about Marie, so Marie keeps talking in situations where Marie would not talk. Marie would listen because she's trying to get the story. So I think that there's sort of inherent problems in the movie. My advice to you would be to read the book.
Hi, my name is Akanksha. I'm also a journalism student here. I'm a senior. My question was, as a journalist who goes out and covers war zones, how do you get a hold of the underground hidden facts that possibly people in authority positions wouldn't want you to get and come back in one piece and tell the world, especially considering that journalists will stand out amongst the locals in such an environment?
Oh, that is a great question. I mean, sometimes it's not as esoteric as it might seem. I mean, it's just literally being there and encountering something that someone's talking about or something that's happening. Other times, it has to do with planning to make the most use of the situation and knowing what your reporting obstacles are going to be. So, for example, I was talking about these situations where we had a lot of government minders. So what we would do is that these people would basically be wanting to make sure that nobody had a conversation with us without them hearing it. But they were also totally terrified that we might take a picture of something that we're not allowed to take a picture of and then they get in trouble. So what we would do is we'd have 2 or 3 people with us, a photographer, an interpreter, and me, and we'd split up and we'd all be like wandering around, and they would get panicky and they'd have to like split up, and one of us would be alone and would have a private conversation with someone. You know, on the other hand, there are things, there are really like deep, dangerous investigations that people do. You know, my colleagues, we had to split up the duties between going in the government-held and the rebel-held area. So my colleagues who specialized in the rebel-held area, they spent time with rebel groups, and they happened to witness them doing what seemed like to them like a real crime. They were taking a prisoner. This is a crime of war. They were taking a prisoner and making him drive a suicide truck. And they just happened to be there when that was happening, and then they had to sort of negotiate the situation where, well, how are they going to ask questions about this? How are they going to film this? How are they going to write about this, and then come back to that area of Syria again without getting killed? So that involved some investigative skills, some diplomatic skills, some negotiating skills, and all kinds of things. So there are infinite examples, but that's exactly what the challenge is.
Thank you.
My name is Salvatore Arena. For many years, I was an editor and reporter at the New York Daily News. Excuse me. I wonder if you'd address the question of the responsibility of your supervisory editors in your organization and Marie's organization to protect you, to guide you, and to perhaps bring you back when you're going too far. How does that work? How did that work for her?
Yeah.
How does that work for you?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Look, there was a lot of controversy about Marie, and there were many people on the Sunday Times who felt that after she lost the sight in her eye, and because she had, she was diagnosed at one point with post-traumatic stress disorder, which she learned to manage, and she had a problematic relationship with alcohol, that some of her colleagues thought she should have been taken off the road. Marie did not want to come off the road. That was what she lived for, and she loved it. And it's very hard to imagine Marie in any other situation. Certainly her employers did try and give her other opportunities to be a columnist, which she didn't want to do. She did have one glorious summer where she was the sailing correspondent, which she really enjoyed. But it's a very fraught question, and I think that in modern newsrooms, I think that probably she would have, they would have been harsher. And I think that the Sunday Times went through a lot of soul searching and so on after she was killed. And I think that part of the problem with Marie, or for Marie, was that it was like she built up a brand, and her brand was the best and the boldest, the brave woman with the eye patch who will go anywhere and go in further and stay longer. And she bought into that herself. And the paper used it. It was incredibly glamorous to have her, looking as she did in the byline. But she didn't always feel inside that she was that brave person. And certainly, arguably, there should have been a lot more discussion about that. But having said that, they never stinted on the insurance, and they paid for her PTSD to be treated and all that kind of thing. With my employers, they're pretty good. There's never any pressure. I mean, for a year after Marie was killed, I just couldn't go anywhere dangerous. I just couldn't bear it. And that was fine, and nobody put any pressure on me at all. And very importantly, I think with my organization, for example, in Aleppo, we had a journalist called Wad Al-Khatib, who's from Aleppo, who's a filmmaker. She's an amazing woman. She was, I think, 23 years old when she started working for us, and she made incredible films for us. And we made sure that she was insured, and she had safety equipment, and she had the training, and that, everything that we could do to protect her, which was, you couldn't do everything. She lived in Aleppo, but that she would be treated the same as a staff member, and she is safe, and she's come out, and she's now living as a refugee. But I think that there are a lot of questions about how things used to be done. I do think things have changed.
Yeah, I mean, the New York Times also has pretty strict rules about security protocols, and those did become much more tough and institutionalized after Anthony died.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Gurnur, and I'm a journalism student here. I just wanted to ask you that you said that the ripples of this war would be felt all around the world after it's over, but it doesn't seem to be over, and the apathy only seems to be increasing on the public front. Do you think it has something to do with the coverage? Even though it's detailed and scintillating, people are growing more and more apathetic towards it?
What can I say? We can always, we always feel some of that sense that if only our coverage was more amazing, we could keep people to care more, But I have to say that I think there's many other factors, which is just the vast proliferation of different kinds of media, the sort of fatigue of hearing about war and traumas all around the world, and most importantly right now, the obsession with politics in the era of Trump, and there's just so much going on. So I do think that Syria is still getting covered, but it's just competing with a lot of other things for people's attention.
Do we have one more question?
I think we have one more question here.
So I'm Giulio Di Stefano. I'm a business major, so not really related to journalism, but I've recently developed some kind of interest in the matter. And my question is, now it's hard to filter through fake news and fake plans, but at the same time I've recently read about plans made by the Trump administration to not only try to push the Iranian militia out of the country, out of Syria, but also to push away Russian and Iranian companies that are planning on rebuilding Syria, although that's quite debatable what those companies are doing. How do you think Marie would react to this kind of plans, and how do you think that would fix the situation if it was true? Oh, sure.
Well, I think what the question was about the Trump administration talking about Iranian and Russian companies trying to rebuild Syria and how, but I didn't understand
if
the
they
fake
want to
news.
block them.
Trying to block them, right. And how we think Marie would have reacted to that. And there was a fake news element at the beginning. What was that?
No, that was just because, I mean, that's not really defined what they're trying to do, or
Right.
a lot of times it's either fake news or fake plans, or it's just rumors. And I mean, my question is just, I don't know how that would change anything.
Well, I think that one of the issues about Marie is that Marie, I mean, it's a slightly hard question to answer. Marie didn't tend to do stuff about business and that kind of thing. And she sort of, you know, that kind of policy reporting was not really her thing. Her thing was very much being out there and doing the human story on the ground. But I think that when it comes to fake news and when it comes to Trump, I mean, it's not my job to channel the dead, but I think I know what Marie would have felt. And I think that Marie would have been horrified. And I think that if Marie were still with us, I think that she would have two priorities. And I think that her two priorities would be to continue to cover Syria and also to cover Yemen, which is the most neglected war there is. And I think that if she was with us, I think that's what Marie would be trying to do right now.
So let me, can you hear me? Is the mic on?
Speak louder.
Can you hear me if I yell for a second? Yeah. Good. So I just want to end on a couple of notes. The first is that Marie Colvin was a remarkable woman, and she is a very inspiring figure, despite all of the darkness and the death. She's an amazing person, and the book that Lindsay wrote, and I don't say this because Lindsay did a lot of it or part of it while she was with us. The book is a remarkable book. Lindsay will be outside signing the book if you want to buy a copy and talk to her right after this. Second, I want you to join with me in thanking two journalists who I think are heroes, Barnard and Lindsay Hilsum, and thank you both for coming here tonight.
Thank you, Harry.
Thank you.
Thanks, Harry.